Hello, friends, poker family. I know all of you in poker think I have abandoned you for the esoteric pursuits of whatever the hell it is I've been up to releasing content about on YouTube. But I have not forgotten you. I am back with a poker related podcast just for you guys. And the topic of this podcast is going to be primarily how we find edges in the game that aren't so explicitly based around study and theoretical concepts. So I hope to dive into all kinds of topics like human intuition, emotions and their place in the game, how we have the best possible mental game, even things like lifestyle, diet, health, sleep, etc. I want to get into all the nitty gritty of all the details of how to be the best performing player we can be outside of just studying solvers. So, to start, we have Andrew Lichtenberger, better known as Lucky Chewy in the world of poker. Andrew's an incredible tournament player, an incredibly bright guy, and just a well rounded human being, from what I can tell. This was our first long conversation together. We've met each other maybe once or twice in the past, and I really enjoyed the conversation with him. So we dive into topics about human intuition, honesty, and quickly touch on what it was like for him to get started in poker. Lots covered here. I think incredible insights are given by Andrew and how to best be the most honest and most intuitive version of yourself at the tables. So without further ado, I bring you Lucky Chewy. Chewy, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate having you here, and I'm excited to
Yeah,
have this conversation.
yeah. Thanks for having me. I'm also excited.
Yeah. So softball first question.
Okay.
Where does Chewy come from? Like what is how does Lucky Chewy become a name you choose?
Yeah, so um my mother was kind enough to pack me Chewy granola bars for lunch every day in elementary school. And some of my peers noticed this, and one in particular started calling me Chewy. And it's kind of an affectionate, loving nickname, right?
Yeah.
And that kind of just stuck. Like other kids started calling me Chewy. That was it from third grade on. And then when I found poker, I already had that nickname, or rather, I still had that nickname,
Yeah.
and I just threw Lucky in front. And
Wow.
yeah, there
That's
it is.
I'm gonna be honest, not the answer I expected. I thought it would be something that came around when you were choosing like a username for poker, but no, it's like a long standing and has
A
nothing
lot
to
of
do
people
with
say Star Wars.
yeah, I thought Chewbacca. I thought for sure there's a Chewbacca reference in here somewhere, but um so if you don't mind, just give a brief it doesn't have to be super in depth, but overview of kind of your journey through poker. How did you get into it? What has it been like for you? Where are you at
Yeah.
now?
Yeah, so let's see. Junior year of high school, I was working in a bowling alley, hosting birthday parties for children. That was a challenging job. My bosses were playing party poker, generally limit hold'em, trying to hit that bad beat jackpot. And this was coinciding with the moneymaker era. So in the year or so following, when I was a senior in high school, I uh, took an interest. I was already into games, so I was playing a lot of Blizzard games online, Diablo, Warcraft, World of Warcraft, that kind of stuff. Um, and then finding out that poker is a game you can make money at. I actually sold a Warcraft 3 account for $70 on eBay with a really good heads up record. Night Elf for the win. One of my claims to fame.
That's amazing.
Um, but yeah, naturally, poker had a lot more lucrative opportunities than grinding out accounts and selling them secondhand. So yeah, I pretty much just took a liking to the game. Started playing with friends around town. A lot of my friends were also kind of getting swept up in that moneymaker era. And yeah, one thing led to another. Started playing online, continued kind of like traveling around Long Island to play in different games. Um, it went pretty well overall. And yeah, that
The rest is history.
offered me, sorry, what's that?
The rest is history.
The rest is pretty much history. Yeah. I mean, I can fill in a few more details. I joined 2 Plus 2 a year or so later. Started reading the archived posts. I was avidly sifting through old card player articles. Um, I made friends with a few guys who were grinding the same games as I was online at this point. So initially this was 2004, maybe let's say now we're in like 2006, 2007. Uh, I started to do a lot better, started traveling a bit, meeting some of these friends. Um, 2008, I moved into a beach house in the Jersey Shore for a summer with Dan Smith and Steve Silverman. Randall Flowers was there for a short while. And then 2009, I went to Vegas, my first World Series, did really well. I got 18th in the main. I got second in a 5K shootout. I think I only played 10 events and I cashed in half of them and pretty good catches. So
That's
yeah.
that's sick.
And I moved to Vegas and yeah, then the rest is truly history at that point.
Yeah. What was the point where it was like, this is a real thing I'm doing? Like because at that
Mhm.
era, I felt like it was pretty, it is more, I guess, within poker culturally normative that people pursue poker professionally. This is a thing, maybe not in culture at large, but at least as you're on the fringes of poker, tons of people are trying to become pros. It's not uncommon to meet people who play professionally, but I feel like at that time it had to have been a more of a, you're kind of a forerunner, if you will, of like just a lot of uncharted territory ahead of you.
Yeah.
When was it that you kind of looked up from the things that you're doing and realized, oh, I'm actually like, this is the thing. This can be my career. This can be the thing that I do. And yeah.
Yeah, there were a few stepping stone moments like that. Probably the most profound one that comes to mind is when I was still, so I did go to college. I attended 3 semesters at Stony Brook University, and probably near the end of the second semester, I started to really get the idea in my head that I'm good enough at this game, and this is exciting enough, at least relative to everything else that seems to be an option, that I'm probably just going to pursue this, and nobody can really tell me otherwise. And I
Yeah.
remember I got called in for a meeting with the guidance counselor at Stony Brook because my grades were unsurprisingly not that great. And I hadn't picked a major yet. I was just not really that drawn to academia.
Mm.
And uh, yeah, they asked me like, "What do you want to do?" And I was like, "Yeah, I want to play poker." And they're like, "What? Like, what are you talking about?" And this is just kind of a quality I've always had. I'm willing to be pretty honest, even if it's like contextually confusing.
Mm.
Um, but that was what I wanted to do. And to the question you asked, I think that was a pretty distinct moment. I remember around that time period reading through a particular old 2+2 thread where someone was talking about like, these are the things that I wish I knew when I went pro. These are some of the challenges I didn't know I was going to face. A lot of like money management stuff. And
Yeah.
yeah, it was around that time that I made that kind of firm choice.
That's amazing. On this point of, being the kind of person who's going to be honest, independent of the context or how people might feel about it. I think it's an interesting thing to highlight because I do think there's a actual through line from that quality to, for people listening. We've never really interacted much, but I've heard from other players who I know, that you put a fair bit of emphasis, or at least my understanding of it is on your more intuitive sense in spots. Like you're obviously,
Yeah.
yeah, like what your ability to, let's say, experience other people's emotional states, or to get a sense of what people are going through. I actually do see a through line from the kind of commitment to honesty, that where you're kind of self-reporting your experience when someone
Hmm.
asks you a question, versus the inclination to ever not say something true is a kind of conceptual gap between kind of what you're experiencing and what you want people to know, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
And I think
Yeah.
there's a way that, really honest people is a way to, like, when someone asks you a question, you kind of just like look inwards and feel what you're feeling and kind of just self-report that experience to somebody. Um, do you see this through line as well? And yeah, just speak a little to everything that I've touched on here. Like, what do you think is unique about how you approach the game and where you find edges? And yeah, and what do you see being missed by potentially some other players or big pros or the poker population as a whole.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how much of it is missed by others. It might be on a relative basis undervalued,
Mm,
you know, compared to how I perceive these things. Uh, I guess the idea of honesty in poker, I've always felt that, you know, honesty with yourself about, like you said, self-reporting, like how am I doing, during a session can be important. After a session, I think it's critical. It's really easy to end up in this weird like phase of cope where you're like, yeah, I did everything like as good as I could have. And it's like, really? Like, did you? Like,
yeah.
no one except for you yourself is going to be able to actually kind of break that down and discern whether
Mm,
it's true or not. Um, and I think a lot of times, you know, it's hard to admit that you were wrong, uh, or at least I don't necessarily feel I struggle with that as much. Certain times it can be tricky, but I think generally people don't love acknowledging that they were wrong. And
mm,
in The Art of War, Sun Tzu says, retreat is the hardest trait for any general. And this
mm.
is kind of, to me, somewhat enmeshed with that idea where you have to like, you know, realize that you got yourself in a bad situation. You got to like get out of it. You can
Yeah.
also relate to, like more practical poker things, right? Like folding is kind of a form of retreat. Um,
Excuse me.
but yeah, no worries. Yeah, I would say I think compared to other higher stakes players, I might be more willing to make deviations based on the ways in which I feel about a situation. I think it's a really kind of interesting topic that weaves in honesty, um, intuition, kind of in a way body technology. Like
Yeah.
the way in which your body feels about certain things can sometimes be an indicator as to whether or not it's a good idea to take those actions. But the trick is that you really have to be very honest about it and know what those signals are. And discerning signal from noise can be very tricky. And again, there's no one else that can really do that for you, um, unless and until we get kind of uh, some more science to track different metrics in this realm, whether it's states of heart coherence or brainwave states or what have you. Um, yeah, I think I'm more willing to trust those things and put emphasis into them because I feel like at the highest levels of play, um, the margins are very small, right? So if you're able to, in a quote unquote close spot, in a theoretical sense, make
Right.
a choice that feels kind of more distinctly or definitively correct, given the intangibles, that can be worth a lot. So yeah, that's I think probably something that distinguishes me. Again, I don't think that there's really any top player who doesn't take into consideration these intangibles to some extent.
Yeah.
Uh, but I guess I've kind of naturally found myself in a situation where I'm branded more as the guy who is willing to make those deviations. But some people think of me more as a math person, so I really don't actually know what most people like on the whole kind of perceive me as.
Yeah. I mean, because where I find honesty, you brought up the honesty thing. I wanted to get to what I thought the overlap I view between, let's say, ethics and I guess just being a social person, like a person who views yourself in a social context and the value that that can actually bring to your game. And I actually
Mhm.
do view honesty because your first reference to honesty is as kind of like being honest with yourself of how you did and how you played. But this is a kind of an epistemic honesty where you're kind of being honest about how your play might compare to your best guess of an objective right play, if that makes sense. Like you're kind of being honest around how, if your decision measured up with what you think might be best. But there's this other kind of honesty, which is just your willingness to interpret your experience for what it is, right? And this your willingness to say, this is how I feel.
Yeah.
And what I do think is similarly, if I asked you, like, what do you want to do? The willingness to say, well, like, when the idea of playing poker comes into my mind, my nervous system responds in this way, if you will. Like it kind of gets excited by this idea. And that means to me, this is what I want to do. And I'm not putting that through the filter of how appropriate is this feeling? Is, like, is this something that will be accepted, or is this something that like means something about me? And similarly, I do think people, when they're playing poker, have a really hard time not putting their experience in the moment through all of the filters of status and culture and what they think is appropriate, their own, and so the result of that is like a lot of self-doubt, like a lot of, I have this feeling, I have this instinct,
Hmm.
but because I don't know how to kind of just receive the data of that and not put it through all the filters of like, is this an okay feeling to be having in this moment, if you will, right? Just the honesty of, I do feel this way. This is the way that I feel.
Right.
Then there becomes a lot of conflict around when your intuition, especially particularly when your intuition gives you the idea for a play or an action that will be viewed in a status sense as bad. Like
That makes sense.
like our brains, I think, have really strong intuitions for status. It's like one of the most important things for
Oh, like from our
success.
peers.
Yeah, from our peers, right? And
Yeah,
just like,
yeah.
does this person, will this play, if I make this play and I'm wrong, what is the cost of that on the way my peers might view me?
Right.
And that's a kind of that, I think that filter of experience can be incredibly difficult for people to break through, of like,
Yeah.
yeah, of yeah. And yeah, so do you find this to be the emphasis you put on these kinds of reads? Is this something that you try to intentionally become better at? Like, do you have ways of trying to practice honing your intuitions and spots beyond just playing more and being more present with that? Or
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I've done for many years now is if you just take a deck of cards and you just try to feel out what the card is as you're turning them over, it's not engaging your logical mind at all. It might be a completely useless exercise. I'm sure some people watching this will think that that's absolute nonsense. Um, but it is a way to engage kind of
mm,
an aspect of your being, let's say, that
mm,
has absolutely nothing to do with rationale. It's like there's, I mean, I guess you could say as you're turning over cards, like, okay, a few sevens and eights are gone, like whatever, but it's not really about that. It's more about just engaging an aspect of yourself that is not born from logic, because you can train logic, you can train intuition, and you can train them both at the same time, which poker, of course, does. But one thing that comes to mind with what you're mentioning is I think emotion is extremely helpful in being able to guide you towards discerning what you should do. But once you take the action, you should remove emotion from it, because at that point, you've used the emotion that is present in the situation to be able to give you a solid enough understanding of what it is you want to do. But when you
mm.
actually take the action, like when the chips go in the pot or when you make the fold, you should do so with no emotion. That's kind of my thought, because at that point, the emotion's not really going to serve you anymore.
Sure. So let's, because there's a, two ways to kind of get at something like anything like this. There's a kind of description of what might be ideal. And then there's just the reality of, well, how do I, if that's not the case for me, like, right, like I have this emotion and it just, the resonance of it is carrying over. What then do I do? Like I'm taking the action, and that sounds great what you're describing, but that I don't have my hand on the lever of that part of my mind. So what is there to do if I don't feel that way? What would you say? What does that bring to mind for you?
So sorry, if you don't,
So like, because
can't
maybe it
own
might be
your
ideal that
emotion.
I use emotion to make a decision and then I kind of let it go. But there might be some people who feel that that's just not an option. Either I'm emotional and then I'm just like, that emotion's just going to carry over. Like,
Ah, yes, okay,
right,
I
right. So
got
like
you.
I just, and as much as your description of this might be true that that is the best way to operate. How accessible that is to people may feel not accessible, and this may be the reason why some people just try to repress their emotions, is because I don't feel I can
Totally.
let it go, and so when push comes to shove, I'm just going to not use them at all. um
Right. Well, that won't work because repressing them is not going to make them go away. And I guess the first step to solving any situation or challenge or whatever is just awareness of it. So if you
mm,
acknowledge you have a heightened emotion, which again is a good thing, it's just that contextually it can either be beneficial or potentially detrimental. Um, I'll get back to the question in a second, but I think the biggest issue that happens when you let emotion play too much of a role in the actions you take, like let's say you're making a big river bluff and you really want the bluff to work, obviously. If that's going through your mind and you're feeling that feeling of like, I hope this works as you're putting the chips out, um, it's more likely, I think, that you kind of seep some of that emotion out and it's like sensed or detected by the opposition.
mm,
Whereas if you, just kind of cold-bloodedly take that action, you're a lot more likely to succeed because it's, not, uh,
mm.
it doesn't have that emotional kind of packaging or exoskeleton or what have you. Not sure how much sense that makes, but
No, it makes a lot
that's,
of sense. I think,
yeah,
I
sort
mean,
of the way I see it.
I think we as humans have really good instincts for people's motives, right? Like we have
Yeah,
really good, we're very good at picking up, obviously, particularly in a live context.
definitely.
Even in an online context, though, I think given timing and stuff like that, you can
I
kind of
agree.
start to get a sense of what's kind of going through somebody emotionally. Yeah. So this brings up another question, though, too, which is of the same vein. How does one do that? How does one learn to take actions in a less results oriented way in your mind? And well, and then a follow on question to that: do you really think this is that big a concern? That I do think people have good intuitions for the motives of others. I also think people are pretty bad at trusting themselves. So my general feeling around worrying too much about this, obviously depending on your environment, but is like it's not, people themselves are generally not really trying to listen to that part of themselves in my experience, and so they're more or less picking up on it. But yeah, so two-parter, like one, how might somebody do that? And the second one, does this feel like a legitimate danger, like something that there is something that people should be concerned about when that their motives are going to leak out into the environment they're playing in?
Um, well, I think the way in which you would train yourself to do this is just to practice more stillness.
Mm,
Um, I think that's generally kind of the way to, it's not repressing the emotions, it's kind of feeling them,
mm.
letting them exist, and then letting them pass, or being okay with their being there, but not kind of indulging in them.
Yeah,
Uh, and then like how dangerous is it not to do this? Well, I mean, it just depends on what your goals are. Like, I don't think it, I think generally speaking, a friend of mine has a great quote, be a child in life and an adult in business. And I think the adult aspect is that kind of taking actions
mm,
without emotion, because you just have to sometimes do things that are unpleasant, right? And uh, in poker, maybe the big river bluff or the three bet or whatever it is isn't unpleasant, but it still has that kind of like intensity and necessity to rise to the occasion to execute it flawlessly.
yeah,
So yeah, it just depends on what your goals are. I mean, if you're a casual player, it probably doesn't matter that much. If you're somebody who aspires to play at a really high level, yeah, I think it matters like a pretty good amount. Um, again, it's just going to really come down to how your actions are perceived by others. Maybe you can just feel uh, extreme joy
yeah,
or extreme kind of anxiety, take those actions and have it work for you. I
yeah,
wouldn't recommend that. I mean, joy is better than anxiety, uh, but yeah, it's just not, or at least for me, it hasn't always been feasible to
yeah.
summon that in the midst of a poker
Yeah,
battle, so to speak.
Yeah, and I do think interestingly, like to add a layer of nuance and see how you feel about it. I do think the feeling that you're experiencing is less relevant than, like you said, the stillness piece that you mentioned really is a shift of motivation towards the feelings that you're experiencing. Because if you're experiencing extreme anxiety, but within you don't mind, right? You're just like you truly are fine feeling anxious. What seeps out in that moment, if your true desire is like, I just want to feel anxiety as deeply as I can. That's my intention. That's my motivation in this moment. I think what seeps out is when people can tell that your actions are particularly wanting one thing to happen because it will relieve you of an emotional state that you do not desire, right? So I'm feeling anxiety more so, and I'm bluffing in this spot, and I'm wanting to get out of this situation that I'm in. Like I'm hoping that this has this particular outcome because my experience is one that I'm either not okay with, or similarly, like you were hinting at Joy, you're pursuing a particular desirable outcome. Either you're avoiding an undesirable situation or you're pursuing a desirable one. And I think what's the way to like emphasize the stillness aspect is if you can in each moment, your motivation while you're taking actions, the moment you take the action for your intention to go towards experiencing what it feels like in this moment, like this is now my goal, this is now what I'm trying to do. That is, I think, an incredibly difficult motivation from somebody to pick up on, like, what the hell does that mean about what they're going through? Because they don't, if your desire is just to feel whatever you're feeling, and that's true when it's good, that's true when it's bad, that's true when it's neutral, that's true. It's just, I can, that to me is, that is the thing that seems to me to be seeping out less than you feeling anxious, you know? And I think over time, the more you're willing to feel feelings, just
Mhm.
you will feel less anxiety naturally over time. Like you just get less worried. But what do you think of that kind of packaging of what you just said?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like you're touching kind of on the idea of acceptance and just
Yeah,
okay with what's happening. And yeah, I think it's a great strategy generally.
yeah,
I I mean, I think everyone prefers feeling better. Like positive emotions are generally favored over negative emotions. Neutrality, that kind of emotionless state can be powerful as well.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, I think it's gonna vary based on the situation and the individual. But yeah, I think striving for uh, of that state of acceptance and just kind of working towards
yeah.
incremental or gradual improvement over time with whatever it is you're dealing with is probably wise.
Yeah, and I guess I bring it up to like kind of emphasize because I think it can be easy to start. It can be so sinister how sneaky you can your desire to kind of take an action free of emotion. And then when there is an emotion present, your desire to take an action free of emotion actually starts causing the very things that you were trying to avoid by taking the action free of emotion, right? Like you're like, this emotion is evidence that I'm not, to take your quote, being an adult in this moment. It's like I have failed to take this emotion, to take this action emotionlessly. And when in my view, when you are accepting, it's pretty irrelevant the emotion you're experiencing in terms of what you look like from the outside. Like when you're really accepting of what's happening, you can be going through all kinds of emotional states, and it can be pretty imperceptible um, from the outside.
I mean, from an observer standpoint.
Yeah, from an observer standpoint, yeah. Like if
Yeah,
if you wish it to be imperceptible, I guess I should say. Like if I
right.
don't right, if I don't want my emotions to be pulling on my behavior in any way, the really only reliable way I've seen to get closer to that is, yeah, like you mentioned, just the willingness to feel fully whatever you are feeling in that moment.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the things that, to kind of bring it back around to the logical side, because I think there's this push and pull constantly of like emotions and reason, right?
Mm,
I think, being able to discern what are the reasons that are causing these emotions can be super helpful and can shed a lot of light on, you know, what's going on in the situation, and uh, whether pleasant or unpleasant, yeah, it can just bring more clarity.
Yeah, and I actually don't see this conflict as starkly as I think many people do. Like this conflict between reason and emotion, I think is a carryover from culturally, like the battle between like man and beast, and this idea that like we have some base emotional instincts that are like at odds with our logic, which I don't view as necessarily true. Like I think there's this really great research article called "All Thinking is Wishful Thinking," and they talk about how all your thoughts are the products of what your goal orientation is in that moment. So like you really can't pry apart motivation and like which you could say emotion and reason and the way we kind of think we can in my experience. Like it's just this mesh of intercausality that are all affecting each other all the time.
It's very true.
Yeah, and
All separation really is an illusion at the end of the
yeah,
day.
yeah, exactly. So I the thing that is unique about poker community that I find interesting that seems to me to be unique in a field where performing at an elite level is the desire. It does seem to me to be the only field I've experienced that almost villainizes intuition and holds up reason and logic to this uh godlike standard. Like all what we're all pursuing is
Yeah,
complete unbiased objectivity. Whereas if you look at almost any field, there's this understanding that you start with explicit teachings and concepts and ideas. You kind of like if I'm learning to golf, I get talked through how to swing, the technicalities of that, and I perform this action very explicitly for a number of years or however long. But then as I move towards proficiency, I let go of thinking about it. This is true, but I mean, if golf is not a good analogy, this is still true in chess, right? Like most chess players are doing a lot of feeling about what is the right play, a lot of intuition, and I think it is interesting to me the sort of stronghold of like logic as prime that exists within poker because as much as you said you don't think this is not valued amongst top pros, there are so many things you said in this interview that from my ear would clearly cause a lot of people to be like no, like that's like even I've heard repression of emotion to be explicitly encouraged by many top pros, and
right.
and so what do you like what do you make of this? Like how do we find ourselves here? Like you
Well,
know
I think we live in a somewhat insane world.
yeah, yeah.
And it's culturally a bit of a taboo to speak candidly the way I'm doing or the way I'm speaking about these topics. So, while you're probably right that other high stakes players would scoff at these ideas in a kind of public setting, I've
Yeah,
spent a lot of time with a lot of players who they're open to these ideas. Doesn't mean that they kind of have fleshed out as clear a framework, let's say, as
yeah,
I have or as I feel I have. But there's an openness to these things. And I mean, the reality is, if you're a human and you sit around a card table and you play poker with other human beings, you're going to feel emotions
yeah,
here.
yeah,
Those emotions will uh, sometimes be signals and help you, and sometimes they're going to be noise. And
yeah,
I think your job is to be able to identify, over time, what is signal, what is noise. And there is the alternative route of just completely shutting them down. But I have never really felt that that was a good enough strategy for me. It didn't just didn't really tick enough boxes.
yeah.
But more power to anyone who does that and has it work for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think the unperceived cost of that people don't realize is you don't really get to shut down your emotions unilaterally. Like it's not you shut down the bad parts of the game. You shut down what drove you to the game, all the joy and motivation and excitement you felt when you were getting into it. So I think that's the real cost. But even more than
And
that,
carry over off the table.
say that again.
It has a carryover off the
Yeah.
table.
Yeah, and that's a big thing that I'm trying to emphasize more and more in the work that I do with people is like, are you pursuing performance in a way that like doesn't have these massive costs in every other area of your life? Like, are you pursuing playing your best in a way that allows you to truly relax when you're with your family, when you're with your friends, when you're, that allows you to more enjoy every other moment of your life, but you condition these habits around how you play, and it just trickles into everything. You can't you're a complete entity. You can't just like be this is poker me. This is
Well,
not
some people
poker me.
attempt that.
What's that?
Some people, I would say, attempt that.
Yeah. And I think it's that's part of the reason I want to have this conversation is because I think it's a really important thing to slowly start um upturning these norms around what it means, particularly because I actually do see it affect a lot of people as they're trying to become poker pros. Like they're the costs on people's lives trying thinking that what it means to be a good poker player is to, I mean, to be fair, it gives me a job. Like, so maybe it's a good thing. But I mean, the cost on people trying to shut down their emotions to achieve the success that they want to achieve in poker and things like that. I think it's really detrimental, not just to the top pros themselves, but to the all the people who are looking to them for how to achieve success in this thing. Um, I don't know if you have
Yeah.
any comments on that, but I have a follow up question. So
Well, I just think the less you're in touch with your emotions, the less authentic you're able to be.
mm.
Um, I don't know if I'm willing to kind of die on that hill, but it feels like an appropriate statement in this context.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're authentic. I think inauthentic, like to be inauthentic is kind of a strange thing, right? Because you're always kind of being authentic to something, right? Because if it's in your mind and you're representing it, like it's just, are you
Uh,
totally complete in that moment? Like, are you authentic to every part of yourself? Are you being authentic to, and are you giving credence and space to the parts of you that don't agree with everything you're saying and doing in this moment? And um, one of the hard things about being human is we never really have like a perfectly aligned, clear motivation, like where every part of us just is happy with what we're doing. I think that's um,
do you think that exists in theory?
I well, I'm a avid meditator, so I do a lot of, and I take a lot from Buddhist tradition. So you could argue that what the picture of enlightenment is this kind of resolution of ambivalence, which ambivalence, like multiple feelings pulling you multiple directions, and I've had experiences on long retreat where your whole, the state that's referenced as samadhi, your whole kind of being really does collect around a single intention.
Mhm.
Um, if you were to ask me if I think that's achievable for the average person in everyday life, I would just say no, it's horribly unlikely. Like what is far more a far more achievable goal that is, I think, in my opinion, equally as rewarding is to become more open and accepting of the ambivalence that exists within you and to allow yourself to be a more free flowing, less defined thing moment to moment, where you don't have to say like, oh, this is what I want and that's all that I am. And there's no contradiction to that, and you just let yourself be this more vague mixture of desires and motivations and feelings. And this, like you were saying at the poker table, then your job is just kind of learn to suss through that in a way that can actually reliably help you make better decisions. Um,
Yeah.
but um, on the topic of actual edges that are delivered here, it is kind of my perception that because of everything that we're saying and what I view as a lack of widespread adoption of the importance of, say, emotional self awareness in the midst of playing poker, emotional self regulation, like acceptance, all of this. I think you have a lot of players who I think people are making emotional decisions whether or not they want to recognize it. I think this is true even if you've suppressed your emotions. I think emotions just express themselves differently in your experience, and then you just call it logic. Like you just call it reason now. But it has been my view that this gap of understanding, anytime there's a gap between how someone thinks their decision making process works and how it actually works, and your ability to understand that gap better than they do, to me presents like a massive opportunity for edge. What are your feelings about this? Do you feel like this is a big area for edge on, especially in my opinion, top players? Like I think there's a big area for edge on top players here.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I do agree that in general, that is a way in which you can gain an edge over someone in poker is they, let's say your opponent, has a certain style and game plan or whatever, and they have blind spots and you've identified those blind spots. I mean,
Right.
that's naturally going to be one of the ways in which you um, can triumph over them. I mean, this goes back to like probably
Right.
some of the most basic things like bet sizing tells or like value thresholds or whatever. Um, so yeah, I definitely see how that can be significant. And then in oneself, you have to always kind of toe that line of, uh, we're back to honesty, right? Like, am I playing in a way which is is balanced, does make sense, or if it's unbalanced and doesn't make sense, is there a good enough reason for it? Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I think that checks out based on my experience.
Yeah, and I think there is a direct connection between your ability. If imagine we just wanted to understand people, like we just want to understand how what it's like for people to process decisions and like make decisions, and your actual only point for direct data for that is you as a person. Like I'm a person, here I experience um all the things people experience. Now they might not be exactly in the same ways that people experience them. Like the same experience in me doesn't produce the same effect that it might in you. But I have found that like your ability to really model well the minds of other people really is limited by how well you seem to
Oh, you
even
even
understand
understand.
yourself. And really what I'm trying to make a sales pitch for here is that I think that the gap that you're talking about, I think most people, where people have a game plan and where they have holes in their game plan, they don't understand it. I think the widespread idea is that where you're going to find the holes in these game plan is through the ways in which people employ explicit logic incorrectly, where I have a game plan and this is what I'm going to do. And that presuming that people are actually doing what they think they're going to do, but then what they're doing is not as good as they think it is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so
Whereas, but
totally.
whereas I'm of the opinion that I actually think there's independent of people's game plans, their limitation to execute on that game plan will be their own self awareness and hand to hand and moment to moment. Like they can say this is my game plan, and then they can depart massively from it, and the cognitive dissonance can just cause them to deny that they've departed massively from it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
This is going back to what you said about how you can't really suppress emotions. They'll just find other ways to seep out. And I think this happens at times. I've certainly seen it in aspiring kind of students of the game. They'll take an action and it'll be like, all right, well, why'd you do this? And they'll say something that just doesn't really make sense.
yeah,
And then when you kind of further probe with logic, it's like, well, if you did this because of this reason, but that reason wasn't really accomplished. What do you think about that? I mean, eventually you can kind of pin it down and corner it with the logical probing. And yeah, sometimes, it is an emotional thing. It's like, well, what were you feeling at the time? Oh,
yeah.
I was feeling like some insecurity or whatever. Um, so yeah, I think that this all kind of checks out based on my experience.
Yeah. Do you when you work, do you do a lot of coaching? I'm not familiar if you're like do a lot of
I do
coaching.
some coaching. Yeah.
Yeah. Is this something like these types of things we're talking about? Is this something you work on explicitly with your students? Like, does it become a big part of kind of the way you coach, or does your coaching still take on mostly sort of like technical flavor to it?
I like to kind of take a more kind of balanced, holistic approach to coaching,
Yeah.
where if someone comes and they really want technical acumen, I'm happy to deliver that. But just as you were earlier saying that you can't really separate these things, logic and emotion, from one another. Uh, I do get a fair number of students who are more interested in that kind of holistic, embracing emotion, softer skills side of the game. So I think it's just, whatever is contextually relevant to help the person kind of get to the point where they can increase their chances of success most greatly.
Yeah. Do
Become
you
more
see
fulfilled and happy.
in this kind of soft skills department, do you see consistent or common roadblocks among students that might be worth highlighting? Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's largely what we've been discussing. It's overlooking emotions or not being completely honest with yourself. And that's a skill, right? Like being honest with yourself is not something that you, in all cases, can just kind of snap your fingers and have it be like, okay, now I'm doing this. You have to really kind of develop that inner dialogue, right? And start to flesh out like, well, if I'm doing this because of this reason, but it's not really accomplishing the goal, like, why am I doing that? So yeah, it just takes time, it's a
yeah.
process. And it really does come down to like what are your goals? I think uh it's very easy to pin things down and say like, oh, this is right or this is wrong, but context is everything. Some people might not be as interested in achieving the absolute highest levels of poker success, but might just want to get a better handle on maybe just what it is that even success looks like, just so they can have that
Mm.
as a kind of light at the end of the tunnel or whatever, or just a kind of picture of, uh, this is maybe what I might strive towards, and the degree
Mm.
to which they want to put effort into doing that is really just up to them, and it's just about kind of what it's all
Yeah.
choice, right? It's just
Right.
what do you want to pursue? Yeah.
I mean, what's funny is even in the way that you talk about this, though, what there is this understanding of, which is just like the respect of individuality and like your everyone's personal journey. Like everyone has different things that matter to them, and I do think that this overlaps a lot with everything we've been talking about. The more you are honest with yourself, when I work with people, one of the things I bring up a lot is we're not trying to make necessarily good decisions. We're trying to make more honest decisions. Like we're trying to make decisions that represent us more honestly in terms of what now we can in retrospect look back and think, okay, this was wrong for these reasons. But um yeah, this understanding that like what is right, I think this carries over to even poker decisions, but like what is right for any person is extremely contextually relevant for like where you're at in your life and who you are. And so like what is the right decision for you in a moment might not always be the one that you look back on and think is the best one later, but it can be one that is based on the context and the way that you're feeling. Like given the way that I'm feeling, it would be an act of self-denial to do anything other than this, right? Like I'd be kind of denying like a part of myself. And um yeah, do you mind if I probe a little into kind of what it is actually like for you in decision making moments? Like are you willing
Yeah,
to kind of
sure.
discuss like
I'll just add one thing before we jump to
yeah,
that.
go ahead.
Um, what you're saying relates directly to the pockets of our modern kind of poker community and culture that heralds logic above all else. It ignores the very simple and somewhat clear reality that not everyone plays poker for that reason. Like not
Yeah.
everybody wants every edge. Some people just want a social experience. Some people just want to actually feel what it's like to make those decisions.
Mm.
And anything kind of far and wide in between or outside of it. It's one dimension of the game, theory and logic. It's a very important dimension. But it is just one dimension in a multi-dimensional game and experience.
Well, there's this, yeah. I mean, even getting here, like I think one of the biggest missteps um, in thinking about logic and I don't even like the word emotion because I think emotions has a pretty narrow definition, but just felt experience in general, right? Like whatever your nervous system is doing in any moment. There's this belief that like, well, logic is really good for understanding the objective world, and feelings are like not good for that. And there's actually massive amounts of neuroscientific evidence that says the opposite, that our explicit logic exists evolutionarily to help us act on the world, to help us interact with the world. So we build concepts around things. So for example, I can say this is a thing that I use to smash heads with, like this is a, whatever. And then so now when I say rocks, I can view all rocks as the same, even though they're not the same. Every single rock is different. Every single rock is unique. And the way you actually experience reality is through implicit felt senses of what is, of what when the world presence is to you, when you just are presencing experience, it can't be boiled down to concepts or logic or you know ways of thinking. Logic is really good for action, but actually intuition and your felt sense is your best tool that you have for understanding, for actually experiencing what life is like, for what this moment, what is actually happening in this moment. The way we evolved to do that is not through logic. Logic was meant to be able to carve the world into neat pieces so we can then act on it once we understand it. There's this really
Love
fascinating
that.
book. Yeah, there's this really fascinating book called The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist. And it's all about how the master was always meant to be kind of the felt sense of presence. And this is primarily in our right hemisphere. And the emissary that the master kind of sends out to go do things is the left hemisphere, which is kind of like explicit concepts and logic. And what has happened over the history, beginning with Greek rhetoric, is this exaltation of the emissary and of logic. But the result of that is now you have this logician or this emissary who's completely cut off from this source of actual knowledge about the world, like what the world
Right.
actually is. And so you're trying to act on the world, but you don't understand it. And that creates a
Right.
lot
Yeah.
of anxiety and stress and frustrations.
It
And
would have
so,
to.
what's that?
It would have to.
I would have to, right? So I think, yeah, I mean, in hearing your description, the thing I wanted to pin down is even that logic is not even our best tool for understanding the world. Like people are thinking like, oh, well, I'll use logic so I can understand. And no, logic was meant to act. Logic and thought and explicit concepts was meant for action. And that's why most people are right-handed because your left hemisphere controls the right side of your body. It's very explicit. And so we're right-handed because we manipulate the world with our left hemisphere.
Very
Um,
nice. Yeah, it makes sense.
yeah. Um, so yeah, given that, I kind of just want to hear as best as you can, kind of, you've talked about having a kind of framework for working through moments and decisions. Like, can you say more about that? Like, what is that like? Maybe we can imagine a hypothetical scenario. Is it the
Yeah.
same in like really big spots as far as small spots? Do you go through this kind of reliably, or is it dynamic? Just say whatever you feel comfortable saying about that.
Yeah, yeah, totally. So, I would say, kind of just a broad overview of what a framework might look like in poker is, there's a lot of variables at play, right? Just practical known things like position, stack size or SPR, what the ranges might look like, and ultimately what strategy you want to play. And as you sort of start to consider what those variables are in any given instance, that's when I would stop kind of using, or at least I would then start to look to let my intuition guide me towards what are the most relevant aspects of the set of parameters in
Mm,
this particular situation. Um, and that can look, different for different cases. But I think it is important to be able to identify what those factors are, and then let, kind of the more intangible, softer skills guide you towards what are the most significant components in a given instance. So
mm,
let's just say it's a situation where you've arrived at the flop and you are considering betting or checking, and you are maybe considering a couple of bet sizes. Um, I think that that's a case where you can sort of default to that, just sort of one dimensional, theoretical approach where you just roll for a bet or a check or a big bet or a smaller bet, and that's something a lot of people do. That's not something that I've ever done. That's never really spoken to me, and I feel like that is because there are a lot of intangibles at play.
mm,
And some of those might be, just the speed at which your opponent has checked the flop, or just generally like the way that you feel about the situation. Because ultimately, if you're taking actions that don't line up with how your kind of internal constitution is uh, perceiving the world around you, at some point, this choices you're making and way you're feeling being at odds with one another is going
mm,
to uh, cause conflict, and that's not going to be great. So
mm.
uh, yeah, this is kind of one kind of probably somewhat common example where I would use intuition to help guide my decision making. And yeah, I think does that kind of answer the question?
No, it does. Yeah. And I think some of the things you highlighted, which are really fascinating, is this idea then, again, if we go back to this idea that your intuition is actually what is kind of mapping your this moment, like of what it is. And if you're
Right. So
acting
trusting that there's the ability to perceive information, which is not, as you so nicely put it, immediately detectable by the logical, rational mind.
exactly. And so what this can kind of parallel to, like what there's two different kinds of problem solving that we kind of use in psychology to talk about. And there's what's called linear problem solving, which is logic, right? It's an explicit amount of steps. I can solve every problem the same way. So math is this way. You can give me any numbers. I just have I know the process. I go through the process. I always get the answer. But then there's parallel problem solving. And this is things that are done for any creative act, anytime where you have massive amounts of information coming together simultaneously to create an answer that is not, you can't linearize it. Like once you linearize it, you're not it is happening now. Like it is all happening now. Like it's you've failed to presence the all the confounding variables. And again, this goes down to like this is an actual hemispheric difference at the level of the brain. But yeah, what you're pointing to is this when you kind of take this felt sense in a moment, what you're allowing your brain to do is to parallel problem solve. It's taking in, like you said, there's all of these intangible data points. There's no possible way for you to linearize all of them, for you to like be like, okay, he did this. What does that mean? He did this. And in working with players, there are so many moments. I have a really good example of one where your attempt to linearize it causes you to overlook something so obvious.
Mhm.
And now you've like kind of hard coded the meaning of something, and you're just stuck. You're trapped in this conceptual world that you can't get out of, like because you've defined something as something. An example of
Mhm.
this is I was working with a student who showed me a hand, and it was a multi-way hand. They were in the big blind, and basically what happened was the button snap checked. So it was like big blind hijack button. I can't remember exactly the flop. It's not super relevant. What matters is they snap checked, and to my the student I was working with, is meant everything to them. They're like, all right, they snap checked. They don't have a lot of snap checks here. There's not a lot of things that they would just think to snap check with. And I just asked them, they're showing me this hand history, and I just asked them like the simplest question. They get to the river presuming they have no like really nutted hands because of the snap check. And they make a big bluff catching call, and the person had a nutted hand. And all I asked them was, how long did it take for hijack to act? Like how long did that person act quickly as well? And he was like, oh no, he tanked for a while. I was like, okay, well, this snap check now means nothing. This person had that person's entire time bank to, and the point that I'm highlighting here is when you just kind of like say snap check means this, right? It's just like this conceptual
Right.
linearized thing. And you're not kind of just taking in the data and like letting your mind highlight what matters to you. You can kind of easily make mistakes where you actually believe the opposite thing is happening, that's not happening. Um,
Yeah, it's a great example.
yeah. And I think I really loved this point though that I didn't quite get to emphasize of when your intuition is feeling something and you're not acting in line with it, you're going to end up with all this conflict. And I
Mhm.
think once, if you grant that it's your intuition that actually is understanding the world and or trying to make a picture of the exact world that you're in, it makes a lot of sense that if you start acting counter to that, your nervous system starts feeling like I don't know where we are, literally. Like I don't know in what world we're living in. Like I'm now in this other place that I feel like I just don't understand where we're at. And that's the kind of tension you feel. It's just like a complete you're kind of lost in that sense.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And yeah, that's a tricky thing to wrestle with for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Especially when if you continue consistently kind of ignore the signals that your intuition might be giving you, at some point those signals will become more and more dull, and then it'll be as if it doesn't exist at all.
Yeah.
Um, And some people choose to live that way. And I mean, again, it's really just a choice. It's like
Yeah.
like how do you want to live? Like
Yeah.
what are your priorities and like what are you interested in?
Yeah. Definitely. Definitely. Well, we this has been a good conversation. I have to cut us off at some point because I feel like we could just I could just keep on opening up new boxes of
Yeah,
conversation.
for sure. We can do
But
it
yeah, well, I really hope we do this again. Yeah, tell people, are there any projects you got going on right now, or where can people find more of you? And
I'm in a transitory phase of my life. I will likely I will have some announcements soon. Uh, but at the moment, just hang tight.
all right, and yeah, where can people find you? Like, where are you most active? Twitter? Or,
Um, I've never really gotten into Instagram, so I guess X is probably the best place. My account is just at Lucky Chewy,
yeah,
and yeah, you can find me there.
perfect. Well, I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed this conversation, and yeah, we'll have to do it again because I'm sure we could unpack a lot more. But I hope people will find this beneficial.
Sounds good. Yeah,
Awesome.
I had a blast. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you guys so much for watching. If any of you are interested in hearing more from me, please subscribe to my new newsletter at jaredalderman.com. I also do donation based coaching sessions once a week. I have about a 4 hour slot open for it. So if you're looking for coaching in any of the topics that we discussed, feel free to book and I'll look forward to hearing from you there. Until next time.